This video is brought to you by Motion Array. Hey everybody, today I'm going to be doing an exposure test on the new Kodak Gold 120 film stock and comparing it to what many consider to be the most versatile film stock out there, Portra 400. Before we jump into it, these images in today's video were developed and scanned by Speedy ePhoto, which has been my go-to film lab for nearly 3 years now. Pretty much all the work you see in my videos is processed and scanned by Speedy ePhoto. They've been doing it for 40 years. They're great people and super knowledgeable. Now through June 8th, you can get 10% off all developing and scanning orders at Speedy ePhoto. Check out the information in the description for more details. I want to give a quick shout out to Kyle McDougall. He made some exposure tests a couple of years ago that were really helpful and very insightful. It's kind of where I got the idea to do this video, so I'm sure all you guys are already familiar with Kyle, but if you're not, head over to his YouTube and Instagram, show him some support. He's a very talented photographer and awesome dude. I'll put his links in the description below. So for this test, I went out to my backyard and framed up a relatively simple composition. It was an overcast day here in Washington. Ideally, I would have liked to have performed this test in harsh sunlight to get some deep shadows and highlights so I could really push the limits of these two film stocks, but I think we can still get a good idea of how they perform with this overcast lighting. For the test, I went one photo at normal exposure on both film stocks and then up to 5 stops overexposed and down to 4 stops underexposed. I used the Pentax 6x7 mirror lockup with the 105mm lens, and my settings for the baseline exposure were f8.5 at 1/500th of a second for Portra 400 and f8.5 at 1/250th of a second for Gold 200. Let's take a look at the results. As I mentioned, the scans were done by my local lab, Speedy ePhoto, on a Noritsu 3212, and I did not edit these photos at all in Lightroom. However, the lab will make some adjustments to the photos during the scanning process to make sure that the images look as normal as possible. When we compare both images at their normal exposure, we see all the expected characteristics from these two film stocks. Overall, Gold looks warmer and has more of a yellowish purple tonality, whereas Portra has a more greenish blue tone. Gold also has a bit more grain prevalence in the highlights, and when we look at the grass, Gold has richer greens that are more saturated. Comparing Gold at the normal exposure and Gold at one stop overexposed, we see a pretty striking difference. It is rendering much cooler and slightly more green. The grass appears more color accurate in my opinion, and the grain in the highlights is slightly less intense. Overall, I'd say that the image at one stop of overexposure is a more accurate representation of the light as it appeared in real life. Now, because of the drastically cooler color temperature in the one-stop overexposed Kodak Gold image, I want to compare it to the normally exposed Portra 400 image. We're seeing much more similar colors, with Gold being slightly more green overall and Portra being slightly more purple. In the highlights and midtones, however, Gold still carries some purple hues. The Gold highlights also present more grain, but the shadows now have a comparable amount, or maybe even slightly less grain than the shadows of Portra. Now let's bring the Portra image to one stop overexposed as well. Both of these images share similar characteristics as our last comparison, with Portra becoming slightly cooler than it was when normally exposed. When we zoom in on the grass, we see that the greens of Gold 200 appear much brighter and more saturated than those of Portra. But Gold is starting to lose some detail and definition as Portra remains contrasty. Moving from Gold at one stop of overexposure to Gold at 2 stops of overexposure, we start to see a slight shift towards purple in the shadows, and a very subtle shift towards green in the midtones and highlights. There's more grain in the image, particularly in the highlights, and the greens begin to darken and lose color richness. Bringing Portra up to 2 stops over, we see that the greens of Portra appear more burnt and a little warmer than they do in Gold. Portra still has less grain in the highlights, and the Gold highlights are slightly more purple. The midtones and shadows of Portra are a bit cooler, and the deepest shadows in the image reveal a greenish tint for Gold, while Portra remains purple. At 3 stops of overexposure, we're seeing very similar results as we saw at 2 stops overexposed. When bringing gold to 4 stops of overexposure, the grain intensifies throughout the image, particularly in the highlights. The highlights are also shifting to a purplish blue color. The greens take on more of that burnt look and lose significant detail. Looking at both stocks at 4 stops overexposed, there's much more grain in the highlights of gold, which is a consistent theme throughout the test. The shadows of Portra look much cooler. Overall, gold still retains a bit more of that warm look, while Portra is on the cool side. At 5 stops over, gold has pretty much fallen apart. The colors are muted and the image is really starting to take on that expired film look. The contrast has diminished and sharpness is greatly reduced. If we look closely at the grass and fence, we can see that Portra still hangs on to a reasonable amount of contrast and detail while not experiencing an overbearing amount of grain, and the highlights of gold have turned into a bluish mess with a very strong amount of grain. Comparing Portra at our base exposure and Portra at 5 stops over, we see a cooler image overall, a loss of detail and contrast, and more grain, particularly in the highlights. But if needed, I'd say this image is still usable with some work in Lightroom. Comparing gold at our base exposure and at 5 stops over, we see a dramatic loss of detail, extreme desaturation and color shift, and a strong amount of grain introduced. And I really wouldn't feel comfortable using the image for anything important. Now let's move in the other direction. Comparing gold at our base exposure and gold at 1 stop underexposed, we start to see that classic film fade when slightly underexposed, some color and detail loss in the grass, and noticeable grain increase in the shadows. Looking at gold at 1 stop under and Portra at 1 stop under, Portra has less grain in the highlights and roughly equivalent grain in the shadows. At 2 stops under, things really start to get interesting. I was surprised to see Portra suffer a significant loss in detail, saturation, and contrast. There's more grain prevalence in the shadows and a comparable amount of grain in the highlights. Gold definitely loses a bit of quality, but I'd still consider the gold image to be somewhat usable, whereas Portra has pretty much fallen apart. At 3 stops under, gold has reached its threshold. Both images are basically unusable with similar amounts of grain, and Portra appears much more faded. So I'll finish with some final thoughts and key takeaways here. Kodak Gold does render usable results at +2 stops, and I think you could get away with +3 stops if you really needed to. But at +4 stops, the color shift becomes too extreme and really starts to take on the vintage expired look that might be fun if that's the style that you're after, but really isn't my jam for the stuff that I shoot. Kodak Gold also seems to become much cooler at just 1 stop of overexposure, which looked more like the normally exposed Portra image. This could have just been the way my lab adjusted the photo, but I did specifically ask them to make sure the adjustment process was consistent throughout the correction of all 20 of these images. So I did find this result to be particularly interesting. So when it comes to the overexposure battle, Portra 400 is the clear winner here, boasting much more latitude with really solid detail and color retention. When it comes to underexposure, it appears as though gold may have an extra half to full stop of latitude, rendering what I would call a usable image at 2 stops under, whereas with Portra it seems like you can only get away with underexposing by 1 stop. So after all this has been said, I'd like to offer a couple things to consider moving forward. First of all, I'd like to see this test done in sunny weather with some brighter light. I feel like that may cause some different results from both of these film stocks, so let me know if that's a video that you guys would be interested in seeing in the future. Also, it is possible that the light did change ever so slightly in between shooting the roll of Portra and shooting the roll of gold, although I did meter multiple times while I was shooting both rolls to make sure that the light was staying consistent, but that's just one of the variables to consider, so definitely take that into consideration. It might have changed by half a stop, but I was monitoring it the whole time and it seemed to be pretty consistent throughout the whole duration of the test. I also don't think I'll end up shooting gold when it's cloudy, because in overcast weather, when I shoot color film, I tend to prefer a little bit of a cooler look. I think it's a little bit more lifelike, and gold is a warmer film, so when you pair it with overcast lighting, you can see that the scene renders pretty warm, and this might be a good opportunity to use that 1 stop of overexposure to kind of render a cooler image. But 9 times out of 10, if I'm shooting color film when it's cloudy out, I'm just going to shoot Portra 400. All right, everyone, that wraps up this exposure test for Kodak Gold and comparing it with Portra 400. A bit more of a technical video, which I feel like I'm not the best at, but hopefully you were able to take something away from it and learn a little bit. It was pretty insightful for me to see these results, actually. Didn't expect some of the results that we got, so glad I did the test, and yeah, hope it was valuable to you guys. Other than that, I hope you're staying safe, having fun out there, and I will catch you very soon. Peace. Lastly, I want to thank the sponsor of today's video, which is Motion Array. Motion Array is a one-stop shop for all your video, graphic, title, animation, and overlay needs. With thousands of templates for programs like After Effects, DaVinci Resolve, Premiere, and Final Cut Pro, Motion Array has you covered no matter what you're editing with. I've used After Effects templates plenty of times for Motion Array to spice up my ad integrations, funny video segments, or anytime I need to display information on the screen. I also have been using Motion Array at my normal job for over a year now, utilizing the various callouts and lower thirds templates that are available at motionarray.com. All of the templates are intuitive, easy to use and manipulate, and are very customizable. Motion Array also offers a variety of presets, royalty-free music and sound effects, stock footage, motion graphics and photos, and plugins. I can't tell you how much time Motion Array has saved me from having to create entirely custom animations and motion graphics. It really is a one-stop shop for leveling up your production quality. Use the link in the description to sign up for Motion Array and get $50 off the annual plan.